Well, I'm Dave Lockwood. I'm the Extension Fruit and Nut Crop Specialist for University of Tennessee. And today we're going to talk about some famous nuts in Tennessee. Well, nut crops are kind of an interesting thing. Tennessee is on a transition zone where we can grow a lot of things they grow further south and they grow further north. And so Tennessee, we have the option maybe of more choices than what a lot of people do. But in nut crops, we're going to be looking at about 5 or 6 different types of nuts and talk a little bit about their potential for the home and landscape. Nuts are actually considered to be a fruit, and botanically speaking, it's a single-seeded fruit with a hard shell. And just before I forget it, in the mix that we talk about, we're not including pine nuts because pine nuts are not actually considered to be a nut. So I'll get that out of the way right out front. But nuts have a lot of uses for the homeowner, for the commercial growers. We see a lot of nut crops grown for wildlife purposes. They're a major food supply for many different species of wildlife, but they also are grown for human uses. The nuts themselves are good for fresh consumption, or for baking, for making flours like we do out of chestnut. Some of the nut trees themselves are very valuable. Black walnut, for example, is one of the more highly prized timber species that we have. We also grow hickories, and hickories are prized for use as charcoal. And pecan we can grow as well, and the pecan wood is used a lot in veneers, in furniture making. So they have a lot of uses. It is a crop that we can grow, and whether it's commercial or for home, have some very beneficial aspects with it. So what I'd like to do is kind of walk through production of the trees, starting from just planting them or selecting the trees, actually planting them, and then we'll look at some specific types of nuts. With a nut tree, one of the first things I always ask people when they want to plant it is, what are you looking for? You know, if you're growing a tree for timber, then you might want to grow seedling trees. If you're growing trees for the nut crop itself, then I always recommend grafted trees. And why is that? Well, with a grafted tree, we'll know exactly what the nuts will be like on that tree. Whereas if you grow from a seedling tree, you'd have no idea what the nut is going to be like. Because with seedling propagation, because the nut trees are cross-pollinated with different seedlings of the same type of nut, there's a lot of variation. And so if you have a favorite pecan tree, for example, and you wanted to have more of that type of tree, you would want to buy a grafted tree of that variety so that you could be assured that the pecans the young trees would be identical to the tree that you really want. On seedlings, like I said, you don't have that assurance. Another reason we might use grafted trees if we're growing for nut production is that the physical grafting shortens the time it takes a tree to get into actual production as compared to growing the tree from a seedling. And so earlier production off of grafted trees, and also in some nut production, we're using certain types of nuts to grow out for the rootstock and graft that on, and by doing that we can have a little bit more stability in the rootstock effect on the tree itself. So if you should want to grow a tree for the nuts, like I said, we go grafted trees. There are some nurseries around, not a lot of them, but there are some nurseries around that specialize in grafted nut trees, and those are the ones that you'd want to see. If you want to try growing a tree from seed, then you can do that yourself. If you can get a hold of the type of nut that you want to grow, you can plant that nut like in the fall of the year and stratify the seed. The seed has to go through a period of cold, moist conditions before it'll germinate. And we do that outside and let Mother Nature stratify it, or we can do it in the refrigerator. But plant the seed in the fall of the year. The winter temperatures will provide the germination conditions, and then in the spring the seedling will grow, and we can care for that seedling over time and have a new tree. Now, I like to grow, if I'm going to grow seedling trees out, I want to do it in a confined area. That is in a garden spot or maybe in containers, because that young tree takes a little bit of special care. And then after it gets up to a certain size, you can plant it to its permanent home. If you can do a good job watering the trees, taking care of the grasses and the weeds and protecting them from wildlife damage, you could plant the tree or the seedling tree out in its permanent home and maybe even shave a little time off to getting a big tree, but it's a lot more work to do it that way. So when you plant a tree, if it's a grafted tree, the graft union on the tree, which is quite easy to identify as you look at the trunk, but that graft union needs to stay above the soil line. So when we plant a grafted nut tree, we recommend having that graft union 3 to 4 inches above the ground line. The reason for that, if you plant too deep, the tree is going to be a little weak, and it can potentially root above the graft union, and now you're back to a tree that you really don't know what you've got. If it's a seedling tree where you don't have the graft union to guide you, plant it at the same depth that it was in the nursery, and you can see that by looking at the tree. With a nut tree, when you set it out, first off, I don't like to buy big trees. You can buy trees all the way from 3 feet tall all the way as big as you want to get, but a small tree that's healthy is a lot easier to transplant than a large tree. You get better survival, and quite often you'll get better growth out of that tree. But regardless of the size tree you plant out, realize that when the tree's dug in the nursery, some of the roots are pruned, and it's important to prune back the top to give the tree a better chance to take off and grow. And kind of a rule of thumb we use with nut trees is that when you plant a tree, if it's got, say, a 6 foot tall top, we cut about 3 feet of it off, and that's kind of the standard rule. Cut the top halfway down. You'll increase survival of the tree. You get better growth that first few years than if you had not pruned it at all. Now, it depends on the type of tree that you're growing as to how long it'll take before it starts to crop. In pecan, quite often we'll say, depending on variety, 6 to 8 years on a grafted tree before you might get any nuts at all. On some of the other nut trees, it's a little bit quicker. If you planted, say, a hazelnut or a filbert, you may well have fruit the 3rd year. Nut trees are kind of interesting in comparing to other types of say, fruit trees, in that the flowers are hard to recognize. They don't look like the normal blossom. On a nut tree, you have both the male and female flower parts on the same tree, but not in the same structure. And the male part, we call them the catkins, which look like whiskers, that's where the pollen grains are, is actually formed the year before the pollen is shed. The female flower, which occurs on the tip of the current season's growth, of course, is brand new. So you've got a plant where the male flower is physically separated on the tree from the female. Most all of our nut crops are wind pollinated. And so you've got trees that are what we call self-fertile. That is, we can grow, get a crop with one variety, or, as is most often the case, you need cross-pollination, where you need 2 or more varieties of the same type of nut to give you pollen over a longer period of time, so that it'll overlap when the female flower is receptive to pollination. And so our general recommendation is, if you want to grow for a nut crop and you don't have other nut trees of that same type of nut close by, you need to get 2 or more varieties of the same type of tree. And in the spring of the year, the catkins are going to discharge pollen, and the wind will move it around, and hopefully it'll get to the female flower. One of the problems we have in areas where there are not a lot of nut trees is if at the time of pollen discharge we get a rainy period, a lot of the pollen's washed out of the air, and pollination becomes a problem, and the crop may be very light. One of the nuts that we grow in Tennessee is chestnut, Chinese chestnut. You know, the American chestnut used to be a major player in the eastern part of the state, but chestnut blight took it out. Incidentally, there are some real strong indications that we may be seeing a breakthrough about bringing it back. But chestnut production has gravitated towards Chinese chestnut, or some of the hybrids between Chinese and American. You have good nut quality. You don't necessarily have the same tree characteristics that the old American chestnut had. But there are several good varieties of Chinese chestnut that'll work in this area. Other types of nut crops, filbert or hazelnut, they're the same thing, and it just depends where you are as to whether they call it a filbert or a hazelnut, is native to this area, as opposed to a lot of the nut trees that'll make big trees 50 to 100 feet tall. A filbert is a lot smaller plant. You're looking at 10, maybe 15 or 20 feet if it's trained as a tree. If not, it'll be more of a shrub or a bush, and of course it's not going to get that high. But with the filberts, you need to have 2 or more varieties for cross-pollination. The nuts are a little bit different. Most of the other types of nut crops, as the nut forms, it has a shuck or a husk around the nut that's green, and as the nut matures, that husk will dry and separate from the nut. The filbert doesn't have that same characteristic. But the filberts are good for, if you can find varieties that overlap in bloom time, they'll give you a good crop, and you've got a nice crop to use for a lot of different baking purposes. We do grow a few hickory, and a hickory is a natural hybrid between a hickory and a pecan. Both of those are quite closely related, and you get trees that will get up fairly good size, somewhere in the neighborhood 50 to 70 feet tall, and may have a cross-sectional span of upwards of 50 feet, so they can be a pretty big area, plant. And that's one of the challenges in growing nut trees for the homeowner, is realize that you're looking at, in most cases, a plant that's going to get big. And so you want to have adequate room, not for just one tree, but maybe for a couple of them, to give you the potential for cross-pollination in case there are no other trees of that type in the neighborhood. But hickories are something that you could look at. Several varieties are out there. Hickories are grown a lot for wildlife food. They can be used for human consumption as well. They're bigger trees. Quite often will get on up to 60, 80 feet tall, but we'll see a lot of those around. As I mentioned earlier, the wood on hickory makes some of the best charcoal, and so that's one of the valuable aspects of the woody tissue. And then pecan is perhaps one of the most well-known nut varieties, because of course in the South pecans are such a major part of our production, and pecans are native to parts of Tennessee, to the Mississippi Valley. With pecans, you've got southern, middle, and northern varieties. Depending on where you are in Tennessee, I recommend either the northern varieties or some of the middle varieties. That is, you do not want to plant the same varieties of pecans in Tennessee that you might find in middle to South Georgia or southern Mississippi. They take too long a time to mature the nut. So with pecans, again, you need to have more than one variety to get good cross-pollination. You want grafted trees. Expect 6 to 8 years for your first production. There are some nice high-quality pecans out there that are very high in oil content, and they're a real treat for us. Walnuts, a lot of walnuts in Tennessee. Used to have a lot more black walnut than what we do now. In parts of East Tennessee, there's a disease called thousand canker disease that's killed out a lot of the black walnuts. And actually, we backed off planting a little bit until we found got a little better handle on how serious this disease was going to be. But there are some good grafted varieties for black walnut if nut production is one of your interests. Now, all the nut trees do best in soils that are fairly deep and fertile and not poorly drained. We need good soil drainage, both internal and surface drainage, but the deeper the soil, the better the trees will grow. And so you see river bottoms is some of the best areas for nut production. One of the interesting things about walnuts, and we grow black walnut is the most common. You'll also see some English walnuts. English walnuts are also called Carpathian walnuts or Persian walnuts, but they're a little bit more like what you might see in the grocery store. They're not quite as strong a flavored kernel as the black walnuts, but one of the things the walnut trees have in common is that the roots have a compound called juglones that will suppress or inhibit the growth of a lot of different plant species underneath them. So if you plant a black walnut, for example, close to an apple tree, that apple tree is apt to decline over time and actually die. Or if you plant a young apple close to that pecan, don't expect it's going to live if it's the zone where the walnut tree is. The walnut tree will actually kill out that apple. So it's kind of a unique thing. Mention the English or Carpathian walnut. Again, Tennessee is a transition state, and one of the things that I see with the English walnut is that our changeable temperatures during the winter, that is relatively wide temperature fluctuations within a short period of time, it can cause cold injury to the English walnut trees. So it's been a real problem, and one of the reasons that I have not really pushed it too much because of the cold injury. Now, there's some other types of nuts that you may have heard of, you may have seen. Heart nuts, which actually came from Japan, and butternuts you'll find further north. And then they've crossed the heart nut and butternut, and they came up with something called a Buart nut. But we don't recommend those in Tennessee, primarily because there are some certain diseases around that limits the life of the trees. The quality of the nut has not developed, and so it's not going to be a good selection for our area. But I mention them because a lot of people that may come in from, say, the northern areas may be familiar with those nuts up in where they were from. So those are some of the more common nut crops that we grow in Tennessee, and a little bit about how to select them. We do have information on nut production at the extension offices, and please, if you are interested in learning more about that, contact the county extension office and we can help you out.